Welcome back everybody. Now we've just completed a 2,500 kilometre fully off-grid trip that took us out through Parkes, down through Deniliquin, around the Riverina of Victoria, back up through Junee, Cowra, everything like that, and it was fantastic. This video should follow that because I was originally going to do this within the video, but I thought I'll pull it out because we enjoyed the trip so much and I just thought, let's just keep all that energy going so I can show you all the different places we've been to. But one thing I did do on the trip was I swapped over to this Bluetti Charger 1. If you've been following us for a while, you'll know we put in an EcoFlow Alternator Charger to run with our Delta 2 around about 6 months ago, and it has been fantastic. But Bluetti actually reached out and they wanted me to try the Charger 1. Now I've been reading a lot about these and I was actually quite interested to compare the two. So I thought in this video, let's actually compare the Charger 1 to the EcoFlow Alternator Charger. I'll run through the pros and cons and why I think that this is actually slightly better, primarily due to its flexibility, but there's a few other components and bits and pieces that go into this that actually make it really, really good. This was problem-free, it just worked while we're on the trip, which is exactly what I wanted. So in this episode, come along as I show you what this is all about and how it compares to EcoFlow's Alternator Charger. Now the great thing about these DC to DC chargers is that you know when you get to site in most instances, your power station is going to be fully charged. So with our setup, we run the fridge overnight and we know it's going to draw down around about 15%. So in the morning, I get it all set up and I plug in our coffee machine. Now while I've got the power on for that, I'm also using the USB outlets to charge up our drone batteries, my phone and everything like that. I just make sure that I use everything in first thing in the morning so that we have some reserves down the track in case something goes wrong. Now the one advantage of using the power station to charge your 12 volt devices is that you get the rapid charge function that you don't typically get inside the caravan or really inside the vehicle itself. And that is a real advantage. I find even with the camera that I'm filming on right here, I can charge it back up in around about half an hour with no dramas at all. And you'll note if you actually try to charge any drone battery or anything like that from a normal USB, it takes quite some time. So having the power station for me is actually a huge advantage because I get that real fast charge on the run. The other thing is we can also leave batteries and stuff like that on the little area that we've got behind the fridge here so they can be charging while we're in transit. But it really is a handy compact setup that we've got in the back of the ute here. Even though we're not running a canopy, it's actually been working really, really well. We essentially just run the caravan here on 12 volt mode, as we would do with any off-grid camp. We don't have any fancy stuff inside, inverters or anything like that, but all our 240 volt, we run out of this power station here. And it just keeps things so simple. But it's really nice being able to make a coffee in the morning. If we haven't got this table set up, I'll simply put the coffee machine on the other side on the tailgate, and that works perfectly as a little barista station. But this is our little luxury we take along on pretty much every trip now. And again, having that power station makes it super easy to do. So that's just a quick overview of our power station setup in the back of the Ranger. It means we're pretty much self-sufficient without even needing to worry about solar because we're charging on the run, whether or not we've got the caravan in tow or just a rooftop tent. It makes travelling a lot simpler and it's extremely easy to manage. So anyway, let's get into the comparison now so I can show you what it's all about. But firstly, let's just quickly run through the specs of these two chargers because they are slightly different, and while on paper it looks like a big difference, I think in the real world it doesn't really mean that much. So both these products are essentially DC to DC chargers. They take the current from your alternator or your battery in your vehicle and they transfer it and convert it into a higher wattage to effectively charge your power stations while you're on the go. The Charger 1 is essentially a 50 amp DC to DC charger and it's rated at 560 watt max. But don't be swayed by that because it's got a few little tricks up its sleeve that makes it really, really adaptable. The Alternator Charger on the other hand, well, it's got an output of around 800 watts. So it's essentially a, let's just say 75 amp DC to DC charger. Form factor wise, the Charger 1 is a little bit more compact than the Alternator Charger. They both have fairly robust metal cases on them. The Alternator Charger feels a little bit more robust than the Charger 1, primarily because it's got these plastic end caps on it to accommodate the cooling fans, and we'll get onto that shortly through the video. Now with that, this is almost double the weight. It is roughly 2.3 kilos versus the Charger 1, which comes in at 1.2 kilos. It's also probably a lot better sealed because it doesn't have a fan or anything built into it. I have heard reports of these getting quite hot, and we'll get into that through the video because I really don't think you need to run these at the max wattage, particularly if you're driving along doing the trip that we've just done, or even a weekend away where you're doing a little bit of exploring and stuff like that. You don't need to charge these power stations up super duper quick unless you've got a huge power station and you're running really heavy equipment that is drawing it down. I think if you just look at a moderate input, these will live a lot longer and they'll be a lot healthier while you're traveling along. Now size-wise, the Charger 1 is obviously a little bit smaller. It's 145 by 110 and it's 60 millimeters thick. It does actually have some openings on either end because this is fan cooled. And I think that that's actually a reasonable advantage. The only negative on that, I would say, is that particularly once we've been traveling down a lot of bull dust, fine dusty roads and stuff like that, we have had some dust ingress into the back of the Ranger, but it's actually clean as inside. Where everything was covered in dust, you will obviously get a dust buildup inside these, but at the same time, the fan's going to be blowing that back out. So I don't think it's a major concern. However, if you are naturally traveling on a lot of real dusty roads, the back of your vehicle's just covered in bull dust and stuff like that, you probably need to consider that when you're looking at the Charger 1 product, because it will all get built up inside this particular unit because it's not fully sealed. Now from an inlet and outlet point of view, they don't have dust covers or anything like that. However, there are some dust covers on where you actually terminate the cables in to either end, but it's actually really, really simple. There's not much to it, and that is what I like about this particular product. The Alternator Charger, it's around half the width at 35 mil, and it measures around about 290 by 140 millimeters. So it is a little bit slimmer, a little bit more gracious, and it might fit a lot better onto the side of the back of your seat or something like that without being too obtrusive. It's got these little dust covers on all the ports and stuff like that, and it does actually feel really solid and robust. But the downfall is when all the cables and plugs actually go into the bottom of this. And that's what I want to get into. It's about the cable interface that is the first big difference between these two products. And that is because EcoFlow have their own proprietary cables. They've got these really large fittings that go into the bottom of the Alternator Charger. And while they do have a really nice feel and a real positive engagement into the ports on the Alternator Charger, you do need this special tool to then release these harnesses from the charger itself. So that to me is a bit of a negative because you need to make sure you don't lose that tool. The inlet cable is actually quite stiff and bulky, so it does actually take up quite a lot of room, and it's a lot harder to route through a lot of different vehicles. The outlet cable that actually connects to your power station, it's the same. It's got a proprietary plug on it that makes it a little bit hard to find spares while you're out on the road if you lose this particular cable. Now, the big problem that they've had up until this point is that the input where it goes into your power station, it will only work with only certain EcoFlow products. So the Delta 2, it was compatible because it's got the expansion port on the side, which is what this essentially goes into. And I think from their architecture, that allows them to input that really large wattage that the Bluetti doesn't necessarily need to do. So while this is all well and good, it is a restriction, and it means that the Alternator Charger hasn't really been able to charge up a lot of different products, and it certainly hasn't been adaptable to all different brands. And I think that's where the Charger 1 has worked really, really well. For example, on this trip, I couldn't bring my AC200L because it took up too much room in the back of the ute. So I actually said to Bluetti, look, I'm going to be using the Delta 2 to actually run our fridge, the coffee machine, everything like that while we're on the trip. Did you want to send me an AC180? Or I really wanted the Elite 200 B2 because that would actually fit on the back of this fridge slide and work really, really well. But they said, no, we want you to demonstrate that it will work on all the different products. And I think that's where the real advantage of the Charger 1 comes into play. Now, I'm just going to quickly note while the EcoFlow products out here is that they've actually released the 500 watt version, and that actually deletes this expansion port onto the output of the actual Alternator Charger. So the 500 watt version that's just come out, it runs the XT60, which is very, very similar to the Bluetti product. So just consider that when you're hunting around and doing your research. But one of the disadvantages to me is definitely these ports and the fact that you have to have all proprietary cables, which makes it really, really hard if something happens while you're out on the road. You can't just quickly duck down to the shops and buy something else to keep you running. And it's something to consider because the proprietary nature of all these power stations has been a pretty big restriction up until this point. A lot of them are starting to go all one direction now, which makes things a lot easier if you're out hunting around. For example, when we started the trip, I actually realised I left all our gas hoses at home for the weather. And when we got to parks, do you know how hard it was to find a gas hose? Chasing around when you're on the road is a real pain. So having this restriction, to me, makes it a little bit difficult if you're doing remote touring and something happens to one of these cables. You only have to leave it behind somewhere and that becomes a really big pain in your backside. Now the Charger 1, for its output, it just has simple bootlace connectors that come out to some NC4 connectors. So it makes it pretty adaptable onto anything you want to charge up while you're out and on the road. And that's what made it work really well with the Delta 2 that we've got fitted into the back of the Ranger. Just by having these, I could very simply plug into the back of my Delta 2 with the same XT60 connector and MC4 connectors that I'm pretty sure came with the power station itself. I've got a whole bag full of all different adapters because I run different power stations all the time, and I'm pretty sure this actually came with the power station, but it just makes it so much flexible because an XT60, whether it's the yellow one here or the orange XT60i, they're extremely common these days. MC4 connectors, they're also becoming very common as well. I primarily use Anderson plugs, but for this instance, I've just kept it all pretty much factory and it worked really, really well. Now there is one slight restriction with this that I thought might be an issue, but in reality it's not. Most of the cables that run an XT60 are actually a 12 AWG, so it's a fairly lightweight cable, but I guess the cable run isn't all that long. I did actually try to upgrade to a much thicker 10 AWG cable. However, the one restriction I found was the bootlace connectors that you typically crimp onto the end of these cables, and that is what the interface is on the Charger 1. They were too big to actually fit into the terminal slots on the end of the Charger 1. So that's just something to consider. If you're looking at upgrading the cabling, the connectors probably won't actually fit in. So how this actually works is they run bootlace connectors on both the input and also the output. So these terminals are actually really, really neat. They simply just slot in. You lift up the dust cover and then you secure them into place with the Allen key that's supplied with the kit. Any Allen key that fits will actually work, which is good. And the one slight little gremlin which I don't particularly like is they have an Allen key head on the screws that fix these down, and that's why I can't actually pull these out because I've left it in the caravan. I would normally put all my spare parts in the side of the fridge here, but obviously I didn't do that because we've been tripping around and I've been pulling things in and out, and all my cables and bits and pieces I've actually left in the van because I figured I wouldn't need them for this particular video. But that's actually something to consider. If it just had a flat head or a Phillips head, you'd be able to quickly pull these out, swap them over if you're on the tracks and you're trying to do a quick fix. If not, make sure you actually put that Allen key in so you can pull these out if you have any issues while you're traveling around. But to me, this is a nice simple package, and more importantly, if you do have any issues while out on the road, you can quickly change a few cables over and it's not too much of a drama at all. Not that I suggest you should be a hack, but you could even just shove the cables in and screw it down. If you're really, really caught, just strip the ends off, put them in, and you'd be rip-roaring and ready to go. And that is something you certainly can't do with the ports on the Alternator Charger, and for me, that's a fairly big negative as well. So that takes me on to the ports on these particular units. So they actually run off a 6 AWG cable, pretty much the same as the EcoFlow product, and then the output is a 12 AWG. They have those bootleg ferrules or terminals that go into either end that are suited for the particular cable. Now, Bluetti, the same as EcoFlow, they provide a harness kit as an option onto the products. Now, while I actually got the harness kit with this particular Charger 1, I've actually run an aftermarket cable system. And you'll note when I actually did the install on the Alternator Charger, I had an issue where the factory cable harnesses that come from both these suppliers, they're only 5 meters long. So they work fine in the back of a 4-wheel drive, SUV or anything like that. But if you're running a dual cab ute or you've got a lot of length to actually cover to get from the front battery of the vehicle right through to the rear, then I find 5 meters is a little bit too short. So while I got this harness, which is a really good quality harness, the same as the EcoFlow one. However, I'll say this is a little bit more flexible. So I do actually prefer Bluetti's harness because it's so malleable and easy to route around as opposed to real stiff wires and cables that EcoFlow use. But there is a restriction with these in that they don't quite reach if you've got a larger vehicle, which most of us would have if you're touring the country and doing a lot of exploring. And that's where these DC to DC chargers really come into play. So what I've done is I've actually installed, because I was short on time and it's literally across the road, an XDM 6-meter harness that I got from BCF. Now, Hardcore, Kick-Ass, they all have 6-meter harnesses as well. They're really good quality harnesses, and the really big thing is that they come with MIDI fuses that sit at the front of the vehicle. And that takes me into why I wouldn't get the Bluetti harness, because they have a bit of a flaw in their design. You see, they supply this house-style circuit breaker that is supposed to be installed at the rear of the vehicle, right adjoining your power station. So this bootlace terminal here would go into the positive input of the Charger 1, and this would sit alongside in the rear of the vehicle. Now for me, that's a bit of a no-no, because if anything was to happen to this power cable from the front of the vehicle all the way to the rear and it's shorted out, then this isn't actually going to work or do anything at all. And you've got the risk of actually causing a fair bit of damage or even burning your vehicle down. So you need to have a fuse connection as close to the positive terminal of your battery as you practically can. And that's what a lot of the harnesses do have. And EcoFlow do actually have a MIDI fuse up the front. They don't have this circuit breaker up the back, and that's why I would say that's a bit of a negative to the Bluetti system. Now there's a bit of material floating around, and I think even Bluetti these days do say to install a MIDI fuse or a fuse connection at the positive terminal of the battery, but you need to actually buy that separately and fit that yourself. So it's just a little bit of something to be aware of, and that's why I would go an aftermarket harness, because we get that extra 1 meter length and it works a lot better in these larger vehicles. Now, an important thing to note with the 6AWG cabling that most of these kits come with is that particularly over longer runs, up towards 6 meters, you get voltage loss, and they're really only rated to 50 amps. And that's where the 500 watt comes into play, because really it is a limit of the 6AWG cabling. And while you do have your MIDI fuses and your safety nets into place, you certainly don't want to overload your wiring by trying to run really heavy current through it. Now Bluetti or Bluetti, they also provide a few brackets and stuff to actually mount these in. But the idea is that on the back of this, there's a slot in each of the 4 corners, and you just screw this into the side of your ute, the back seat of your SUV, 4-wheel drive or anything like that. But this worked really well just sitting on the floor in between our fridge slide and the tub liner of the ute. And on the whole 2,500 kilometers, it hasn't moved around anywhere. Sits neatly in here. The cable management works really, really well, where I go up to my Anderson plug, into the input of the Charger 1, and then the output with the MC4 connectors runs around to the back of the power station, goes in and out without any dramas at all. I could even just put some rubber backing on this, just in case it wants to rattle around, but to be honest, it worked faultlessly on the whole entire trip and didn't move anywhere. So for me, that's actually a really nice, neat solution where I can just unplug this, take it out. I can actually pull everything out from the back of the ute and use it as a ute, which is what our intention is with this little setup we've got in the back. So it ticks a few boxes there as well, primarily because I didn't have time to muck around with brackets or anything like that before we left on the trip. But it just reinforces if you keep it all nice and simple, it's probably going to work anyway. So in my case, I've actually borrowed the end of the Bluetti harness. So it had the bootleg terminals that I knew would work in the input side of the Charger 1. And then I've just put a 50 amp Anderson plug onto the end of it. That plugs into the side of the ute and utilizes the harness run that we did originally have installed. And because I had to extend the harness and put some joiners in, that is primarily why I actually changed the whole harness before we left for the trip. I just didn't want any issues with dodgy connections or anything like that. I just wanted the one run all the way through. And while it was a little bit of a hassle rerouting it all through, re-cable tying and everything like that, it's just a bit of peace of mind knowing I don't have any connectors. There's nothing that can really rub through. And I checked everything over to make sure it was all traveling along really, really well. And that takes me into the wattage side of it. And I think that's where people are sort of thinking, oh, the EcoFlow, it's so much better because it's 800 watt as compared to this, which is only 560 watt. But really, while you're traveling along, I'm running the input wattage to the Delta 2 at around about 300 watt. That's all I need. In 2 hours, it's fully charged because we run it down to roughly, let's say 60% on most days. And then that 40%, it doesn't take long to charge it back up. So I've actually adjusted it right down. And the big advantage to me of the Charger 1 is that it simply plugs into the solar input of your power station. So whether or not you've got a power station that has an XT60 connector, anything different, you'll always have an adapter harness usually that will connect to an MC4. So straight out of the box, you can simply plug it into the back of 99% of power stations and you're pretty much ready to roll. That is a really big difference that makes this a winner in my opinion. But there's another component that goes with that, and that is the flexibility of the output to suit all your different types of power stations. So in my case, I just take my XT60, I plug it into the back of the Delta 2, I plug this Anderson into the side of the ute, and I'm ready to roll. There's no dramas at all. But the big advantage is I can actually change and adjust the outputs of the Charger 1 to work with any power station I've got. And that to me is a really, really big thing. And it also means you can fine tune to work with your particular vehicle. Say if you've got an older vehicle that has a smaller alternator, if you're trying to draw a full 800 watts or even 500 watts out of that, it could struggle a little bit. So you can actually wind it down and tailor it to your particular setup. And as I said, if you're doing a lot of long distance driving, if it's charging a little bit slower, it's still going to be incredibly quick compared to just plugging into the cigarette lighter in the back of your vehicle. So these are a really, really good thing. Doesn't matter what you have, what vehicle you have, it'll work pretty much in every single circumstance. So how does that work? Well, of course you need to have an app. So in our case, we've got a Bluetti app to run the Charger 1, and then we've got our EcoFlow app if we want to monitor the power station. But I pretty much have just been using the Bluetti app just to make sure everything's tracking along and we haven't got any dramas at all. But you can easily see onto the front of the power station what's being inputted. And you'll notice I've got the car running now. I've just quickly plugged it in. And if we go into Charger 1, we can really, really quickly see the stats. And straight away, that tells us exactly what it's doing. So right now, because I've got it set fairly low, we're actually inputting around 327 watts. So that's taking the 13.8 from the vehicle and converting it to 40 volt at a higher wattage. So the idea of the DC to DC chargers is they just play around with the amperage and the wattage to make it work in a fast charge application. So if you just simply plugged your 12 volt battery into the back of your power station, which is essentially what you're doing with the cigarette style port on the side of your vehicle, it's going to charge really slow. You need to actually manipulate that so that you're amplifying the power to work best with the inputs for the power stations. And in this case, it's doing the science of increasing the voltage, which is therefore making the wattage higher going into the particular power station that you're trying to charge. And now I'm being fairly conservative here, but if I turn the vehicle off and disconnect the device as it asks you to in the app, you can actually go into Pro mode. And that is where you can really easily change the charging output of the Charger 1 to suit all your different power stations. So if you did want to ramp it right up, it asks you to confirm that you accept all the terms and conditions. Then you go into another area, which is the custom mode. And that is where you can go in and actually enter in the input voltage that you want to run to your particular power station. Now in my case, I'm just going to put it at the 56 volts, which is the max output of the Charger 1. Even though our EcoFlow Delta 2 can technically take up to 60 volts. You got to check and make sure that this is correct. Confirm it's all okay, and then wait 90 seconds for it to reset and be ready to operate again. So once that's complete, you click done and you're ready to go at the updated or altered voltage that you've selected for your particular power station. And if you had a Bluetti product, you would actually just select that particular product rather than doing this all manually. But you can see that we've jumped up to around about 520 watts, so we're just under the 560. But for the case of quickly demonstrating this, we're close enough. And in my case, I now want to actually stop this and change it back to the 40 volts because I think that is more than enough for our day-to-day running and charging of the power station. Now you can go into the app a lot more, but this is a real simple example of how easy it is to quickly change and adapt the Charger 1 to all your different power stations while you're traveling along. Just keep it all nice and simple and you won't have any dramas at all. Now if we quickly swap over to the EcoFlow app, I'll note that they're generally all pretty much the same. The one big difference is obviously in this instance that we've got an integrated app between the Charger and the power station itself. Now, if you're doing Bluetti products joined together, you would have a similar sort of interface. So that is very slightly different. However, it's more how the alternator charger actually outputs into the power station that differs a little bit. In the EcoFlow app, and it might be slightly different now, they've got the more generic 500 watt alternator charger, but you're pretty much restricted to just determining the output wattage from the alternator charger. So while you can adjust the wattage up and down, the intention is really that you pair it with the particular power station in the EcoFlow family that you're trying to charge. But each of these products have very good safety cutoffs so that you're not going to drain your battery while you're sitting idle. They need to see that input voltage from the alternator to your starting battery before that they'll actually process and start charging your particular power stations. Now, I forgot all about this point while we're out and about, but it relates to the front of the vehicle here. And that is one of these DC to DC chargers will backfeed from the power station into the starter battery of your vehicle. Now, I'm sure most of you know which one that is, but that is the EcoFlow Alternator Charger. So it does have an additional function in that you can actually use this to send power from your power station back to your vehicle to top it up if you get a flat battery while you're out and camping or out and about. So you can see here I've got over 600 watts backfeeding from the Delta 2 into the starter battery of the Ranger when we first fitted it up. It's a pretty handy feature. And obviously there's also the battery maintenance function where you can actually, in effect, trickle charge your vehicle. If it's stored away in a garage or a shed, you've gone away on a holiday or something like that, you can use your power station to actually trickle charge and maintain the starter battery in your vehicle. It's probably a little handy feature to have that the Charger one won't do. So you need to consider that in your analysis while you're hunting around and researching DC to DC chargers and power stations for that matter. Now for me, I don't think it's a real big issue because I generally carry around a little jump starter. I've just got a King's one that will get me out of trouble if I need to, but it is probably a consideration in that the EcoFlow Alternator Charger will top up the battery. But I'm sure if you're like me, you've got lots of cables and adapters and stuff like that, you'd probably work out a way to get yourself out of trouble, but it's something that the Charger one won't do. To me, it's not a deal breaker, but definitely something to think about. And all this is confirmed between the app and the display on the power station itself. So our Delta 2 is saying that we're around 60% and we're inputting 316 watts. The app itself is actually saying 326 watts. So there's obviously a little bit of power loss between the actual Charger one and the power station in how efficiently that the power station is converting that to the charging input. So you're losing a little bit there. But for me, the 300 watts was a nice, comfortable sort of range where it would charge this up, as it says, from 60% to fully charge in under 1 hour. That's all you need when you're out and about and exploring. If you were really needing to charge this up quickly, I could whack this up to the full 56 volts that this power station will actually take and fully charge it at the 560 watts. So there's a lot of adaptability and flexibility in this particular system. And the fact that I can use it on all my different power stations really for me is a no-brainer. It just makes life so much easier. And it means I can pretty much pack and take exactly what I want without having to be restricted and swapping bits and pieces over, which is just annoying. Now, I'm sure most watching this video would know exactly how flexible and adaptable these power stations are. They're an extremely handy thing to have around, and these chargers have made a world of difference when you're traveling around, to the point where I really don't think you need solar these days. But this AC200L behind me here, it saved me a number of times, including back in January when we were up in Brisbane. We had a massive storm rip through the estate here, to the point where it actually blocked our main access just down the road, where a huge great big gum fell down. We lost a number of limbs off the big gum out the front of our house here. We lost a whole tree around the corner. The one across the road went, and pretty much our whole corner block here was pretty much decimated. And you can see here from the shots back in January, there was destruction all around us. And now, even though we don't have overhead power lines in this particular estate, our main feed from the highway in behind us here has a lot of overhead power lines, and they were decimated. So we lost power here for around 4 or 5 days from memory. Now, luckily, because we drove back overnight, our fridge contents were all well and good. But I put the AC200L into action by running that fridge for the entire time the power was out. However, the one big drama I had was that I only had the EcoFlow Alternator Charger, that I couldn't use to top up the power station. And we also had really bad weather for the whole week afterwards. So we couldn't really use solar to top up the power station. And it's in these instances that you discover how power hungry some of your home appliances are. So we ran our fridge flat strap off this power station, and its capacity would run it for around about 18 hours. Now, just like if you were running a petrol generator to power your appliances, you could have turned it on and off, but I just ran the fridge pretty much the whole time off. It just cycled on and off. And luckily, we had the neighbours across the road with a generator, so we could just take this across for an hour each day, top it up, bring it back, plug the fridge in, and off we went. The Delta 2 that I normally run in the back of the Ranger, I brought that in also. That charged up all our devices because I had this solely dedicated to the fridge, and it also ran a hot water system. Even though we've got a gas instantaneous hot water system, you still needed that 240 volt power to run it. So there was a few little things that we had to solve there. The Delta 2, I could actually use the Ranger in behind here as a generator to top it up every day and keep everything going. But it was a real drama trying to keep the Bluetti power station running because it wasn't compatible with the alternator charger. And I think that's where the Charger One, in my mind, really came into play. Because if I had this in the back of the ute instead of the alternator charger, I could have kept not only my Delta 2 topped up, but also the AC200L. So I think that is the huge advantage of these, in that they're pretty much adaptable to any type of power station because their feed into the power stations is via the solar input. And that is the key thing here. Now, price-wise, there is a small difference. The Charger One, it's usually on special for around $399, so let's just say $400. And the EcoFlow Alternator Charger is usually $599, so let's say $600. So there's a $200 price difference there. So based on that, I would actually buy the Charger One and put the extra $200 towards a wiring kit to install in your particular vehicle. That way you know it's all nicey nice, it's going to work really, really well, and you've got the adaptability and flexibility of the Charger One. And where I've been a little bit hesitant in the past with these smaller power stations running your real high wattage 240 volt appliances is that they draw a lot of power out. Now that we've got the DC to DC chargers, you can give these a little bit of a hard time as long as you know you're driving somewhere to charge them back up. Now you can idle your vehicle to charge them up while you're on a campsite or something like that as well. Just note, if you're running them at a high wattage, so a high input out of each of these chargers, it's going to put a lot of load on your alternator. And where I come from there is that the alternators have got a fan in them to cool them, and that's designed when the vehicle's traveling along. So if you're statically loading the alternator up, there is a chance that you're going to, over time, wear that alternator out prematurely and overheat it. Now, while we're talking about alternators, the one thing that I have noticed that is, in my mind, a little bit better with this versus the EcoFlow product is that it's a lot more stable. But one thing we did do with the Ranger just before we left on the trip was we had the smart alternator turned off. The one thing I was finding with the EcoFlow product is that it kept dropping out. I was having a lot of issues with it dropping in and out, and I think that was primarily attributed to the smart alternator in this particular vehicle, and the ECU and everything sort of cutting the voltage out because the main drive battery was already charged. So if you do have an issue where your DC to DC charger is dropping out, or it's charging at a really low rate, definitely look into whether or not it's your vehicle interfering with the charging of the power station via the smart alternator. I think that is actually a fairly major thing that a lot of us with caravans are starting to turn off on these more modern vehicles. And so there you have it. Just based on money alone, I think the Charger One is slightly better. The fact that it's got the fan in it, it sort of ventilates itself, I think is a really big advantage. But more importantly, the flexibility and the adaptability of the Charger One, to me, just makes it a much more flexible and adaptable product for, I think, most people these days. The fact that EcoFlow has actually adapted their alternator charger to be a lower 500 watt with an XT60 connector, I think actually shows that the Charger One did have a huge advantage in the market. And I still think the fact that it doesn't have a large cable interface, you can just quickly jump into the app and change the output. It just makes a really big difference. And to me, it just makes such a good, simple product that you can just have in the back of your vehicle. In my case, I can remove it. I can use the ute as a ute and there's no dramas at all. They're both not perfect, but I do think the Charger One solves a lot of problems. You just need to be aware of some of those wiring repercussions. Put a decent wiring kit in and this will work really, really well. If you're in a real dusty environment and the back of your vehicle just gets trashed with water and dust and everything like that, then you're probably not going to want to fit one of these in. And while the alternator charger is for the most part fairly weather sealed, I don't think they say that neither of these should be left out in the elements. And I wouldn't do that with such an inexpensive product. I'm not going to leave my power station sitting out in the elements, and I'm certainly going to try to protect them and keep the dust away from them as much as I possibly can. But they're just a few things to note, and I've been actually really impressed with both of these products. But the charger one for me, it just ticks so many boxes and it works so extremely well. So anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. Hopefully this has been a really good comparison. We're actually going to get back into some of our regular content. I know I've done a fair bit on the Ranger lately, but there's just been stuff going on. We do have a trip up to Fraser Island in July, so it will be back because I've got to show everyone how I put the rooftop tent and everything on this, and that will actually go in with this off-grid setup that we're trying to get working here in a real compact space, because we've essentially got to store everything under the roller shutter here, particularly when we go for these remote trips to Fraser Island, where we went up to a mate's wedding and did this cool inland track last year. We just need to keep a real simple, compact setup that works well for us. But I do need to get on to all my other projects, so if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do that. Put a few comments in below on what you think about the Charger 1 versus the EcoFlow Alternator Charger. What do you think about these products? I know they do need to use an app, but once they're all set up, they're pretty much plug and play. I never really looked at the app the whole time we were on the trip. I'm just looking at the front of the power station to make sure it's working, and that's pretty much it. And share this video around if you think this will help out anyone you know that does a lot of off-grid camping, that might actually have a use for a DC to DC charger to quickly charge while they're out on the go, because it makes such a big difference. Remember, you don't really need solar panels anymore. We don't need to worry about the weather. We can just quickly charge up while we're on the run. And that to me is a really big thing. So anyway, I thank you all for watching. And as I always say, get out there, stay safe, have fun, and we'll catch you next time.